Well, when I was a kid, my parents used to teach me a mantra, which basically they didn't necessarily follow that much in their life, and maybe that's why it was harder for me to learn it. But it was the idea of counting your blessings. And essentially, as Paul continues to talk about what I refer to as the focal points of our thought life, he begins to talk about things that fit into that category. When he said, when we were supposed to, as we previously look at things that are right, things that are pure, but he continues on, he says, and whatever is lovely. And the lovely thing is something that you know is acceptable and pleasing to God. It's kind of that little saying that was, WWJD, what would Jesus do? Which is, I think can be to some degree a helpful way, but it can be also something you can condemn people with. But the whole point is, when you think about something as being lovely, you have to think it from the context of God's point of view. What does God look at it and say is beauty? The psalmist talks about the beauty of holiness. And there's a kind of a beauty that the world doesn't recognize. It looks at sensual beauty, physical beauty, and it finds things lovely that sometimes God says are not lovely, they're abominable. But when he talks about in the Bible about the things that are lovely, the things that you know that God would be pleased with, God would find joy in. When one of my grandkids shows uncommon kindness to another child, I, knowing my own human nature, think, boy, that's unusual. But it's such a beautiful moment. It's so lovely, I think, in the eyes of God. And that's where it fits into the second one that he says, is it admirable? Admirable things are things that lift us up. They lift us up and they make our hearts feel good. And when we see people doing good things for other people, we really admire that. I think even in the current crisis with this horrible war going on in Ukraine between the Ukrainians and Russians, when I see so many Christians who are responding with such incredible generosity. In fact, my elder board, we were talking about the Polish people and how they've responded, and the Hungarian people and the Romanian people, but especially the Polish people. I mean, they've taken in, 500,000 refugees, and how they just have made room for them. And I think how disruptive and crazy and chaotic that must have been. And yet it's so lovely to see such expressions of human kindness, giving and graciously caring for other people who are going through difficult times. I even think about one of our churches that we've been sending some support to, which is in Crimea. And these are Russian churches with Russian pastors and Russian people in the church who are buying supplies and driving down into Ukraine and giving them to the Ukrainian pastors. And it's interesting, the pastor said that the Ukrainians won't even talk to them because they're Russians. There's such an animosity in this particular area towards Russians. And he said, so what we do is we give it to the local Ukrainian pastors so they can distribute these things. And he sent us pictures of some of the distribution and so forth. But you look at that and go, how admirable. You're making the effort to care for people who hate your guts, but they're in need. And so you find a way to get them without trying to get them to give you kudos. I mean, I just look at that and that's admirable to me, and that's uplifting to me. And I think when we see that kind of generosity, as we often say in our church, generosity changes people. And we see a kind of generosity, it's always uplifting to our souls. Then he goes on and continues by saying, and if anything is excellent, in other words, if there's any moral goodness in what somebody is doing, that you see people making sacrifices and serving. To me, oftentimes I look at many single parents we have in our congregation, and I think very few people appreciate what a sacrificial lifestyle that is. To have to get up in the morning and dress and feed and clothe and cleanse and send kids off to school, and then to come home and feed them and get them in bed and make sure they're healthy and strong, and do that day after day after day is really, really admirable. And I think it's virtuous, because they're left alone trying to input into these children's lives some qualities that they hopefully can carry on. And I'm seeing that with one of my sons who's been left as a single father. And it's amazing to watch the sacrifices he makes. I mean, his whole life revolves around making sure those kids are taken care of and their needs are met, both emotionally, mentally, and physically. So it was one thing of just making sure they're fed and cared for, but to pour himself out, it's really virtuous. It's really excellent. I mean, it's just such an admirable thing. And I look at him and say, I don't think I was half that excellent in my life. I mean, it's amazing to watch it. And when you see it, you need to recognize it. You need to mentally acknowledge it. You need to probably express it to him and saying, you are really being an example to me that is really encouraging. And that's where the next thing he says, if there's anything praiseworthy, is there anything worthy of celebrating and applauding? I mean, there's a lot of things that we can say boo to in this world, and we're sometimes more oriented at pointing that out, saying this is the wrong thing or this is where it's off base. But is there anything that we can look at in life and saying, how do we applaud that? As I was trying to encourage my staff last week, just sharing with them and saying, that it looks like the economy is going into a recession. People are beginning to feel the effects of inflation and the cost spikes, and all these things are really having a real impact upon people in very painful and measurable ways. That's the problem with recessions and inflation. They punish the people who can least absorb it. And that's really, really troubling. But at the same time, I was saying to my staff, I said, not only do we need to be willing to minister to people who are going through those times, but to recognize that what that creates is a greater openness to the gospel. In fact, one of the Russian pastors that we work with wrote to me and told me as they're having refugees, yes, some refugees are not running to Poland, they're running back into Russia. As these refugees are running into Russia, he says, we're picking them up at the border, we're giving them clothes and food and some money, and we're sheltering them and helping them to get to other family members where they can escape around Russia. And he says, many of them are, when they see the kindness we're showing, they say, why are you doing this? And they say, because we're servants of Jesus Christ. And they begin to share the gospel. He says, many of these people are giving their life to Christ. So there's something to celebrate, even as something so horrible as a war and the carnage and destruction that's been coming with it. There still is the furtherance of the gospel. There's still people who are able to hear the truth. And so God, in the perfection of his economy, is able to bring good things out of bad things. He's the ultimate recycler. He can take waste products and he turns them into things that are profitable and valuable, especially when we're talking about the lives of men and women. So finding something that's really praiseworthy is really, really critical. And then finally, the very last thing he says to us, think about such things. So if we go back through the list, he's telling us if there's anything that's true, if there's anything noble, if there's anything that's right, if it's pure, if it's lovely, if there's something to admire about it and that's uplifting, if there's something that's virtuous, it's excellent, if there's something that's praiseworthy, worthy of celebrating and applauding, he says, then you should think about those things. And when I looked at that phrase, think about such things, I was again, as I said in the beginning, reminded by what my parents used to say, you need to count your blessings. Now, my parents said it because they were tired of hearing my griping and complaining about something. And in a sense, they were really right. I remember when I didn't want to eat my food, my dad would always say to me, there are children in China who would give anything to have that plate of food. And, I snarkily would say to him as a little kid, well, then can we box it up and send it to him? He always thought that was funny. And sometimes my dad, by finding things I said funny, encouraged my bad behavior. But nonetheless, the principle stuck with me. Even when I got adulthood, I realized that as a Christian, I can focus on everything that's wrong in my life or in the world, but what are the things that I can count blessings for? And today I can count a blessing that I have the freedom to worship God. I have a gift of his word, that I have means of communication. I have a community of believers who pray for me and love me and care about me. These are all things that I can begin to count blessings for, because at the same time I know that there are many in the world who don't have these blessings. So I guess my question is to you, what are the things that you should be counting as far as blessings in your life? I know this may sound really old-fashioned, hackneyed, but the simple fact is, if you sit down and just start making a list saying, what are the things that I should be thankful for? And, you start with people and then you start with things. And, man, I'm thankful I have a house and a car and transportation. I'm thankful I can still afford to put gas in the tank, even though that's becoming increasingly more painful. But nonetheless, I can do it. There's so many things to be thankful for, and that I have health, and that, I have friends. I mean, that in itself makes you a rich person regardless of what you have or you don't have. So try that out. See if it works for you. I challenge you to take 5 minutes and make a list. God bless you and go in His grace.